Think your favorite Instagram boss babe is tough because she runs a dropshipping business from her MacBook? Viking women were literally running households, managing farms, and defending their families with actual weapons while their husbands sailed off for months at a time. These weren't women posting motivational quotes about grinding. They were actually grinding grain by hand before sunrise every single day for decades. Today, we're discovering 10 brutal realities of Viking women's lives that would make today's self-proclaimed boss babes quit before lunch. Get ready to discover what real female strength actually looked like. Dawn Warriors, the 4 a.m. reality check. While modern boss babes post about their 5 a.m. morning routines with $8 lattes and meditation apps, Viking women were already 3 hours into their workday by sunrise. These women woke in complete darkness, rekindling fires from dying embers in homes that barely stayed above freezing. No central heating, no electric lights, no coffee makers, just raw determination and calloused hands working by flickering firelight. The morning routine started with hauling water from wells or streams, often breaking through ice in winter months. Imagine carrying 40-pound wooden buckets across frozen ground while wearing wool clothing that never fully dried. Modern women complain about their commute. Viking women's daily water collection was a marathon that would leave today's CrossFit enthusiasts gasping for air within the first hour. Breakfast wasn't grabbed from a drive-thru or delivered by DoorDash. Every meal required starting from absolute scratch, grinding grain into flour, using heavy stone querns that required serious upper body strength, kneading bread dough until their arms ached, tending cooking fires that demanded constant attention, and preparing food that would fuel families through backbreaking labor. The physical demands of simply preparing one meal exceeded what most modern women accomplish in entire days at their standing desks. Fire management alone was a full-time skill that modern women can't even comprehend. Viking women had to maintain fires that provided heat, light, and cooking capability, and if those fires died, families could freeze or starve. They became experts at reading smoke patterns, managing wood supplies, and keeping embers alive through harsh weather that would shut down entire modern cities. These weren't lifestyle choices or wellness trends promoted by influencers. This was survival. Viking women developed the kind of functional strength that comes from necessity, not gym memberships or personal trainers. Their morning routine would hospitalize today's wellness influencers who think a 20-minute workout is challenging. But if you think their mornings were tough, wait until you see how they managed to run multiple businesses simultaneously without a single app or automation tool. The original multi-level marketing, managing medieval households. Today's boss babes brag about managing multiple income streams through social media and passive income. Viking women were running complex economic operations that would make modern entrepreneurs weep into their artisanal coffee. They managed livestock, textile production, food preservation, household manufacturing, and seasonal agriculture, all simultaneously without spreadsheets, business coaches, or motivational podcasts. Textile production alone was a full-time business that required mastering multiple complex skills. Viking women raised sheep, understanding breeding cycles and nutrition requirements. They sheared wool at precisely the right times, cleaned and prepared fibers, spun thread using techniques that took years to master, wove cloth on looms they often built themselves, and created garments that had to last for years of hard wear. The skill level required would put today's craft influencers to shame. These women were producing everything from everyday clothing to elaborate tapestries that served as both art and insulation. The economics were brutal. One poorly woven piece of cloth could represent weeks of wasted labor and materials the family couldn't afford to lose. Quality control meant the difference between having warm clothing for winter or watching family members suffer from cold-related illnesses. There were no do-overs, no return policies, and definitely no customer service departments. Food preservation was literally life or death business management that required understanding chemistry, timing, and resource allocation. One mistake in salting meat, fermenting vegetables, or storing grain could mean family starvation during harsh winters that lasted 6 months. Viking women had to master complex preservation techniques, manage storage systems that prevented spoilage, and calculate exactly how much food was needed to survive months when nothing grew and no supplies could be purchased. Dairy management required understanding animal behavior, nutrition, milking schedules, and processing techniques. Women who owned cows or goats had to maximize milk production while converting surplus into cheese, butter, and other preserved products. This wasn't a hobby farm Instagram account. It was sophisticated agricultural business management that determined family survival. Modern women stress about managing their online calendars and email inboxes. Viking women managed breeding schedules for multiple animals, planting and harvest timing for various crops, seasonal production cycles for everything from candles to soap, weather patterns that affected every aspect of their operations, and market timing for selling surplus goods, all stored in their heads because most couldn't read or write. The economic value these women generated was staggering, yet they received no recognition, no profit sharing, no business awards, and definitely no motivational speaking opportunities. They were running medieval corporations from one-room houses while raising children and maintaining households. Speaking of raising children, modern women think pregnancy is challenging, but they've never faced childbirth as a literal battle for survival. Childbirth, the ultimate boss battle. Instagram boss babes post about conquering their fears and crushing their goals with hashtags and empowerment quotes. Viking women faced actual life or death battles every time they gave birth. And they did it without epidurals, hospitals, emergency rooms, or even basic medical knowledge that we take for granted today. Medieval childbirth was essentially Russian roulette with a 9-month buildup and no medical safety net. Women faced these potentially fatal experiences armed with nothing but herbal teas that provided minimal pain relief, prayers to gods who seemed indifferent to human suffering, and the support of other women who had survived similar ordeals. The mortality rate for both mothers and babies was so high that women routinely wrote wills and made final arrangements before going into labor. Pain management consisted of biting down on leather straps, gripping wooden posts until their knuckles turned white, and hoping for quick delivery. No pain medications, no medical monitoring, no fetal heart rate checks, no emergency interventions, just raw endurance and the hope that both mother and child would survive the experience that killed approximately 1 in 10 mothers and 1 in 3 babies. The birthing process took place in homes that were barely sanitary by modern standards. Midwives learned through experience rather than medical training, often lacking understanding of basic hygiene that could prevent deadly infections. Hand washing wasn't standard practice, and post-birth complications like hemorrhaging or infection often proved fatal within days of what seemed like successful deliveries. Most Viking women gave birth to 6 to 8 children over their reproductive years, meaning they faced these life-threatening ordeals repeatedly throughout their adult lives. Between pregnancies, they were either nursing infants who demanded constant attention or caring for toddlers while maintaining all their other back-breaking responsibilities. Modern women take 12-week maternity leaves with pay. Viking women were back to hauling water and grinding grain within days of giving birth, often while still bleeding and healing from traumatic deliveries. The emotional toll was equally brutal and would break most modern people completely. With infant mortality rates around 30%, most mothers buried multiple children during their lifetimes. They had to develop the psychological armor to love deeply while preparing for devastating loss, a mental toughness that required compartmentalizing grief while continuing to function as the backbone of their families. Breastfeeding continued for extended periods, often lasting well over a year because families lacked safe alternatives. An infant formula wouldn't be invented for centuries. This meant women spent most of their adult years either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from childbirth while managing households that would challenge modern families with every convenience imaginable. But surviving childbirth was just the beginning. These women also had to master running multiple businesses that would make today's entrepreneurs quit in frustration. The original side hustle, medieval entrepreneurship. Modern boss babes celebrate their side hustles and passive income streams with motivational posts about financial freedom. Viking women were running multiple businesses out of necessity, not choice. And failure meant their families starved rather than just disappointing some online followers. Ale brewing was serious business that required understanding fermentation science, ingredient ratios, quality control, and customer satisfaction that would impress today's craft brewers. Women who mastered brewing could sell surplus ale to neighbors, providing crucial income for their families during times when agricultural work wasn't available. This wasn't a hobby or creative outlet promoted on social media. It was advanced chemistry, applied under pressure with zero margin for error. The brewing process demanded understanding grain selection, water quality, yeast management, temperature control, and timing that could make or break entire batches. Women had to judge fermentation progress by taste, smell, and visual cues that took years to develop. One batch of spoiled ale could represent weeks of lost income and wasted resources that families couldn't afford to lose. Cheese making transformed perishable milk into valuable, long-lasting protein that could be stored, traded, or sold. The process demanded precise timing, temperature control, aging techniques, and storage methods that took years to master. Women had to understand milk chemistry, bacterial cultures, pressing techniques, and aging environments that would challenge modern food scientists. One batch of spoiled cheese could represent the loss of weeks' worth of milk production and the income that families depended on for purchasing essential items they couldn't produce themselves. Quality control meant understanding subtle changes in texture, smell, and appearance that indicated whether products were developing properly or heading toward expensive failure. Market days were the original networking events, except instead of exchanging business cards and LinkedIn connections, women were negotiating survival with customers who could make or break their family's economic stability. They had to master salesmanship, customer relations, competitive pricing, and complex barter systems that required understanding relative values of dozens of different goods and services. These women were essentially running medieval startups with zero capital, no business loans, no investors, and failure rates that meant actual starvation rather than just disappointing venture capitalists or having to find new jobs. They had to understand supply and demand, seasonal market fluctuations, customer preferences, and competitive positioning, all while managing households and raising children. Soap making required understanding dangerous chemical processes using lye that could cause severe burns or blindness if handled incorrectly. Women mixed animal fats with caustic chemicals in processes that would require safety equipment and hazmat training in modern facilities. They did this work in their homes, often with children nearby, using techniques passed down through oral tradition rather than written safety manuals. These business skills were essential, but when their husbands sailed away for months, Viking women faced an even more terrifying responsibility, defending their homes with actual weapons. Home security, when boss babes carried actual weapons. Today's empowered women post about feeling fierce and unstoppable while carrying designer handbags and taking self-defense classes at upscale gyms. Viking women had to actually be fierce with weapons because their survival and their children's lives depended on their ability to kill or be killed. When Viking men sailed away for months-long raids or trading expeditions, women became the sole defenders of homes, children, livestock, and stored resources that represented their family's entire wealth. This wasn't symbolic empowerment or weekend warrior training. It was literal life or death responsibility that required constant vigilance and readiness to use lethal force against human threats. Home defense meant understanding how to use knives, axes, farming tools, and purpose-built weapons as instruments of war rather than household implements. Viking women trained in combat techniques not for fitness, empowerment, or Instagram photos, but because raiders, desperate neighbors, wild animals, and opportunistic criminals posed constant threats to undefended households that appeared vulnerable. The psychological pressure was immense and would crush most modern people within days. These women had to project strength and capability even when terrified, because showing weakness could invite attacks from people who viewed undefended homes as easy targets for theft, assault, or worse. They were essentially single mothers running armed compounds while their husbands were away on business trips that might last 6 months with no communication. Weapon maintenance was another skill that required understanding metallurgy, sharpening techniques, and equipment care that could mean the difference between life and death during confrontations. Dull blades, loose handles, or poorly maintained equipment could fail at critical moments when there were no second chances or do-overs. Strategic thinking was essential for women who had to assess threats, plan defensive positions, and make split-second decisions about when to fight, when to hide, and when to evacuate with children and essential supplies. They had to understand human psychology, tactical positioning, and resource management under extreme stress that would paralyze most people. Modern women feel empowered, carrying pepper spray in designer purses. Viking women carried actual battle axes and knew how to use them to split skulls when diplomacy failed and survival was at stake. But even the fiercest warrior women still had to master the daily challenge of feeding their families without a single modern convenience. The original meal prep, feeding families without grocery stores. Instagram influencers post about their Sunday meal prep with pre-portioned containers, labeled storage systems, and color-coordinated organization that gets thousands of likes. Viking women were managing food production and preparation that would make today's meal prep look like child's play, performed by amateurs with unlimited resources. Every single meal required hours of preparation, starting from raw ingredients that had to be grown, harvested, processed, and stored, using techniques that took years to master. Bread meant grinding grain, by hand using heavy stone querns that required serious upper body strength, kneading dough until their arms ached, and managing wood-fired ovens that required constant attention and understanding of heat management that would challenge professional bakers. No stand mixers, no pre-ground flour, no temperature controls, no timers, just muscle power, experience, and intuition, developed through years of practice and occasional failures. That meant families went hungry. Women had to judge dough consistency by feel, oven temperature by sight and sound, and baking progress by smell and experience that couldn't be taught through YouTube tutorials. Meat was a rare luxury that appeared maybe once yearly when a pig was slaughtered in a process that required understanding animal anatomy, butchering techniques, and preservation methods that would utilize every part from organs to bones. Women had to master preservation techniques that would make that one animal last months using salt, smoking, and fermentation processes that required precise timing and technique. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant hunger, and there were no grocery stores to replace spoiled food or correct mistakes. Organ meats, bones for broth, fat for cooking, and candles, hide for leather. Every part of slaughtered animals had to be processed and preserved using techniques that maximized nutritional value and storage life. Pottage, a thick stew made from whatever was available, formed the backbone of most meals and required understanding nutrition, flavor combinations, and resource management that would challenge today's professional chefs. Women had to create nutritious, filling meals from limited ingredients while feeding families of 6 to 10 people from single pots over open fires that required constant attention. Seasonal cooking meant understanding which foods were available, when, how to preserve surplus during abundant times, and how to stretch limited supplies during lean periods that could last months. Women had to plan menus around seasonal availability, storage capabilities, and family nutritional needs without access to imported foods or year-round fresh produce. Winter food storage was literally life-or-death meal planning that required calculating exactly how much preserved food was needed to survive months when nothing grew and no supplies could be purchased. Women had to execute preservation techniques perfectly because one mistake could mean family starvation during harsh winters that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Managing food was crucial, but the relentless work schedule that Viking women maintained would make modern productivity gurus weep with exhaustion. The ultimate work-life balance. There wasn't one. Modern boss babes obsess over work-life balance, self-care routines, and maintaining boundaries between professional and personal time. Viking women worked from before sunrise to after sunset, every single day, for their entire adult lives. And they didn't have the luxury of complaining about burnout or seeking therapy for stress management. Rest periods were practically non-existent, except for brief moments while performing tasks that allowed sitting, like spinning thread or mending clothes. True relaxation was reserved for after dark when work became impossible without adequate lighting, and even then, women were often preparing for the next day's tasks or handling essential maintenance that couldn't wait for daylight. Seasonal demands meant certain times of year required 16-hour workdays during planting and harvest when every available person worked in fields from dawn to dusk. Women worked alongside men in agricultural labor while maintaining all their household responsibilities, childcare duties, and food preparation tasks. No overtime pay, no vacation days, no sick leave, no mental health days. Just relentless physical labor that continued regardless of weather, health, or personal circumstances. The concept of me time didn't exist in any recognizable form. Every moment was dedicated to family survival, community obligations, or essential maintenance tasks that kept households functioning. Women who lived to age 40 were considered elderly because their bodies were completely worn out from decades of non-stop physical labor that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. Sleep was often interrupted by crying infants, sick children, or animals that needed attention during the night. Women had to maintain alertness for potential threats, while managing exhaustion that would impair their judgment during critical situations. Quality sleep was a luxury that few could afford when survival demanded constant vigilance. Modern women stress about finding time for yoga classes, spa treatments, and weekend getaways. Viking women found time to sleep when they collapsed from exhaustion, and considered themselves lucky if they got 6 hours of rest before starting the cycle again, with tasks that would challenge today's strongest athletes. But perhaps the most brutal reality was how Viking women faced their final years after decades of this punishing lifestyle. Aging without retirement, when bodies break down. Today's boss babes plan for retirement with 401k accounts, investment portfolios, and dreams of traveling the world in their golden years. Viking women who survived childbirth, disease, and endless physical labor faced old age with bodies broken down by decades of harsh work, poor nutrition, and medical care that barely existed. Most women lived only 30 to 40 years, making anyone who reached 50 seem incredibly ancient by medieval standards. A Viking woman's body wore out faster than a wooden cart on rocky roads, and there were no mechanics available for repairs, replacement parts, or maintenance that could extend their working lives. Signs of aging appeared much earlier than today, with women in their 30s often showing gray hair, missing teeth, bent backs from carrying heavy loads, and constant joint pain from repetitive motions that modern ergonomics would consider dangerous. The combination of bearing many children, lifting heavy objects daily, and eating barely enough food took a terrible toll long before what we would consider middle age. Arthritis was practically universal among older women whose hands were permanently deformed from decades of grinding grain, spinning thread, and performing manual labor that would require safety equipment in modern workplaces. Their fingers were often twisted and painful, making even simple tasks increasingly difficult as they aged. Elderly women who could no longer handle demanding physical tasks became valuable advisors within their families and villages, but only if their knowledge was respected and their families could afford to support non-productive members. Their decades of experience managing households, treating illnesses, and surviving crises made them essential sources of practical wisdom that couldn't be found in books. Medieval retirement planning consisted of hoping your children would remember all the times you fed them, clothed them, and kept them alive, then return the favor when you could no longer work. There were no government programs, no social safety nets, and no guaranteed support systems for women whose bodies finally gave out after decades of service. Even more challenging than aging was the constant threat of accusations that could destroy a woman's life in an instant. Witchcraft accusations, when independence meant death. Modern women celebrate independence, unconventional thinking, and standing out from the crowd as signs of empowerment and personal growth. Viking and medieval women who displayed independence, medical knowledge, or unconventional behavior faced accusations of witchcraft that could result in torture, exile, or execution by communities that feared female autonomy. The threat of being labeled a witch created constant fear that influenced every aspect of how women behaved, spoke, and interacted with their communities. Women who were too successful, too knowledgeable about herbal medicine, too outspoken, or too different from accepted norms could find themselves facing accusations that were nearly impossible to disprove. Herbal knowledge that saved lives could be reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural powers, especially if treatments were successful when other remedies failed. Women who understood medicinal plants, brewing techniques, or healing practices walked a dangerous line between being valued for their skills and being suspected of dark magic. Economic success could trigger suspicion and jealousy that manifested as witchcraft accusations. Women whose businesses thrived, whose crops grew better, or whose families prospered might face claims that their success came from supernatural assistance rather than hard work and skill. Social isolation was both a cause and effect of these accusations. Women who lived alone, who were widowed without family support, or who didn't conform to expected social behaviors were particularly vulnerable to accusations from neighbors who viewed them as threats to community stability. The legal system offered little protection for accused women, who were often presumed guilty and required to prove their innocence through trials that were designed to confirm suspicions rather than establish truth. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, and survival of brutal tests was sometimes interpreted as evidence of supernatural protection. But even women who avoided such accusations still faced a final challenge that modern women can barely comprehend. Death and legacy, forgotten contributions. Today's boss babes document their achievements through social media, professional portfolios, and digital legacies that will outlast their physical lives. Viking women's enormous contributions to family survival and community stability disappeared with their deaths, leaving no records, no recognition, and no acknowledgement of the incredible strength they demonstrated daily. Death preparation was a constant reality for medieval people who understood that life could end suddenly from accident, disease, violence, or childbirth complications complications that modern medicine prevents routinely. Women often made informal arrangements for their belongings and children while still healthy, knowing that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Legacy for medieval peasant women lived on only through skills they taught their daughters, and survival knowledge they passed down through families who might not even remember where the information originated. Their contributions to keeping families alive and communities functioning were enormous, though rarely recognized by male-dominated record keepers who focused on warfare and politics. Medieval cemeteries were like parking lots, where nobody bothered writing down which space belonged to whom. Burial practices for peasant women were simple and practical, with most graves unmarked and quickly forgotten as communities moved on and memories faded. When a medieval grandmother died, it was like losing an entire library, except the books had never been written down, and the librarian took all the information with her. Generations of accumulated knowledge about healing, cooking, preservation, childcare, and survival disappeared forever when these women passed away. The irony is staggering. Women who demonstrated more genuine strength, resilience, and capability than most people could imagine are completely forgotten, while today's boss babes achieve fame for accomplishments that pale in comparison to what Viking women handled as routine daily challenges. Modern women worry about their online presence and digital footprints. Viking women left no trace except for the families they kept alive and the communities they helped build through decades of unrecognized sacrifice and incredible determination. These 10 realities represent more than just historical hardship. They're a reminder of what genuine strength actually looks like when survival is at stake. While today's boss babes post motivational quotes about grinding and hustling, Viking women were literally grinding grain and hustling to keep their families alive every single day without recognition, reward, or even basic acknowledgement. What's remarkable is how soft our modern definition of tough has become compared to women who faced actual life or death challenges daily. Start with just one day without your smartphone, coffee maker, or grocery store. Then imagine doing that for your entire life while raising children and defending your home. Maybe we should save the Boss Babe a title for women who actually earned it through blood, sweat, and genuine sacrifice that would break most people today.